Thank you. Sorry for the introduction. There we go. Sorry. Okay, good afternoon to everyone, and I'd just like to say thank you to the EHF for having this meeting and for getting us all together in this afternoon. I must say, without knowing what the other speakers will be talking about in detail, and I really love the thread that's going through our talks here, and I would like to zoom out a bit and talk about the health effects of indoor air quality. And as has been said an hour and a half ago, why is indoor air quality so important? Is because we spend most of our time indoors, and that's the answer for the question. We are spending our times most of the days, especially in developed countries, but not only indoors, and therefore, although many studies, or maybe most of the studies, and most of the knowledge that we have today is about ambient air pollution, at the end of the day, most of our time we're spending indoors, and it can be in our homes or in our other environments or offices, schools, and so on. And again, as has been said here, the indoor environments are maybe even more complex than the outdoor environment. I'm not sure, but definitely contain various different sources of pollution. Now, I also put a little house here to show what we are exposed to in our houses, and it can vary, of course, from house to house. But as we saw before in Professor Weschler's talk, the home environment and office environment and other environments all include different types of pollution and substances that we are all, to some extent, exposed to. And this has also been mentioned before, but I must say that we can talk a lot about air pollution and air quality, but at the end of the day, environmental tobacco smoke, which is the smoke that we inhale, non-smokers between us, is one of the maybe largest pollutants that we are all exposed to, whether we like it or not, whether we choose it or not, and also indoors. Although many bans have been done in many places indoors, still we find, even in school children here in Israel, that although they do not come from a smoking household, they're also show cotinine in their blood. So we can talk a lot about very different kinds of sources, but at the end of the day, one cigarette can really expose us to a lot of indoor pollution, and we need to also always, I believe, mention this as well. And then this happened, and the 70 to 90% time that we spend indoors changed to nearly 100% for many lags of times here in Israel and other places around the world. And the indoor air quality, of course, has become much more of a problem to all of us. And we can see it also now in papers and studies that have been conducted and devices that have been talked about. Suddenly, indoor air quality has become maybe more relevant because everyone is talking about staying at home and what this brings to us. And there's so many effects of staying at home besides air pollution and air quality. But this is just another cherry on the top when we talk about staying in home. So this really brought the indoor air quality even more up to the surface. Now, we've been talking a lot about indoor air and our houses, and we both brought here big houses and nice houses, but we cannot talk about, I believe, about household air quality without looking at certain parts of the world. And when we talk about the health effects of air quality, and any of us who will do a literature review or try to see what comes up when we look about air quality, household air quality, and health, many of the papers that will come against us first will be those coming from developing countries. And the numbers are always just too hard to really embrace, but I really believe that we cannot look aside when we're talking about indoor air quality. And numbers that are coming from the WHO talking about over 4 million people per year who die prematurely from illness attributable to household air pollution. And this, of course, has an effect on different societies and different populations. And when we're talking about developing countries, we are talking mostly about open fires in huts and in small houses. And any of us who traveled around the world a bit in Africa or in Asia, we've seen these things, and it's part of household air quality, and the numbers of the effect on health, on our health, and on these different populations' health. You can see here in the numbers, and most of them are cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease. The global burden of disease, the last report that actually did a systemic review about, and it was published last year, looked at the decline in risk exposures between the last decade, from 2010 to 2019. And they actually mentioned there that among the set of risks that has actually been reduced and declined during this decade is also household air pollution. But yet, in the same report, they also mentioned that the largest increases in risk exposure were for ambient particulate matter. So I mentioned the open fires and the household air quality in places that we call developing countries. But we also talked here before about the increase, about the filtration into houses and how the outdoor environment influenced the indoor environment. And from this report, we see that the fact that ambient particulate matter pollution is in rise, we still, this of course is connected to what we are feeling inside our homes as well. And again, still talking about the developing countries, I think this picture really shows us this global burden of disease and death, because what you can see here is from 2017 and death rates from indoor air pollution. And it is true that most of the red spots and the orange spots and the burgundy spots are around the areas of the African continent and Asia and a bit of Central and South America. And probably when we think about the way houses are built there and life is being held in those places, we can understand that probably most of this air pollution is coming from the different ways that open fires and fuels and so on, that we do not really talk about today, and I'm not going to elaborate upon this, but this is still something we need to keep in mind when we're talking about health effects of indoor air pollution and attributable deaths, and we can see it here. But if we're talking about moving to what is maybe called developed countries, and we can look here at from data coming from the European Union, and I will show you now three charts that look very similar to each other, but the legend is different, but they all are linked, of course, to each other. And here we can see the key exposure agents that are actually influencing indoor air quality in the different countries in Europe. And we can see here that the large effect, of course, is from combustion particles, but there's also other exposure agents that come from other sources, and some of them, of course, were mentioned here before, and I won't mention them again. But when we try to see what are the sources of these exposures, so again, the green part here of the pie really corresponds nicely to the purple one here, and the main source here is ambient air quality. But of course, as we said before and was mentioned also, there's other sources of exposure that is more part of what's happening inside our houses, if it's, for example, heating or a water system, furnishing, and etc. And if we turn from here to how it affects our health, and as mentioned again before, why do we actually care? We care because of this slide. We care because there is a association between the air quality in our homes and our health. And this is why I guess most of us care about what's happening in our indoors, because again, you can see the red part of the chart here that corresponds very nicely to the green and purple that we saw before. and this is actually the health outcomes of cardiovascular disease that today is really, as we know, is the second leading cause of death in Israel and the first leading cause in many countries around the world. And really the connection here to both to ambient air pollution, but definitely also to indoor air pollution is very clear from this chart. And we can see this across Europe. And of course, other respiratory diseases, of course, are also connected and associated with indoor air quality. The annual burden of disease caused by indoor air pollution, including polluted outdoor air used to ventilate indoor spaces, is estimated to correspond to a loss of over 2 million healthy live years in the European Union annually. So if I showed before the map of the world, and most of the red and orange spots were coming from places other than Europe, these numbers are also quite disturbing for us when we think about the effects of air quality in our homes and in our indoor environments, and how it affects our health. I like this chart very much because I think it really shows the combination of both sources, the outdoor sources and the indoor sources. And as I mentioned before, we know a lot, there's a large body of evidence that shows the connection, the association between outdoor sources, ambient air pollution, and cardiovascular disease and other diseases and respiratory disease, like we can see here in the blue charts here on the left side of the slide. But we cannot blind ourselves to what's happening here, and we can really see that indoor sources are a large contribution to cardiovascular disease and to other diseases. So it's very easy, I think, to look at what's happening outside. We know it's much easier. I won't say it's easy, but it's much easier and much more developed the way that we measure what's happening outside. And if we talk about regulation, it's maybe even easier or doable to have regulations about what's happening outside. And I think all what I mentioned now is what makes indoor air quality, the health effects of indoor air quality much more cumbersome. Because it's difficult to measure it, it's difficult to measure the effect on our health, but still we cannot ignore it, and we've seen it in the charts that I just shown. When we're talking about studying the health effects of indoor air quality, and we've seen in the previous talks a lot about exposure assessment and the filtration between the outdoor and the indoor and how they correspond, these measurements. And of course, there's the modeling. But when we try to put inside, and each of these, of course, methods are not simple. And then if we want to combine the epidemiology inside everything and really look at the health effects, this is also a difficult question to answer. How do we measure the effects? How do we measure what's happening in our bodies? Does anything happen in our body at all? Going back to what Professor Berman said in her EHP paper that was mentioned before, why do we even care? Does it really affect us? And of course, there are questionnaires, and we know that questionnaires are good and easy maybe to implement, but are very prone to bias, and the data that we can get from questionnaires is sometimes not so informative. But of course, we have today, and as mentioned also before, all the issue of biomonitoring last decade, or even in the last few years, even if we're talking about here in Israel, about my biomonitoring that has been really expanded and advanced, and biomonitoring is done also in studies here in labs here in Israel. But still, this imposes a big problem for studying, since of course when we're thinking about people, children, adults, biomonitoring is not something that's so easy if we have ethical issues, and also people who would be happy to participate in these kinds of studies. But still, the biomonitoring is getting more and more advanced, and with the metabolomics, it's also being more and more advanced in the last 5 or 10 years. I think the health effect assessment is getting much more better, but still it's of course very expensive and can be very and difficult to implement in different kinds of populations. But this is of course something that we need to consider when we're doing health effect assessment.
1 minute left.
Okay, I would like to, with the 1 minute I have, just to raise two things that I would like to talk about when we're looking forward. And I cannot finish the talk without talking also about climate change, because I don't have to say anything to this audience about climate change, but when we think about it in terms of how it will affect our indoor environments, if the temperatures will raise, our air quality in indoor, allergens and infections and flood damage and water contamination, all these things we need to keep in our mind, and we can maybe use it as a discussion point. And we really need to understand how current and emerging building infrastructure, design, construction, and materials may affect health in the context of climate change. And we really, and this was mentioned also before in the talks, when we think about how buildings are designed today, what materials are used today, many times it's talked from the perspective of engineering, but we also need to keep in mind the person who lives, the people who live inside the house, and how the way that houses and buildings are built will also take under consideration the effect of air quality and the health of people living in these places. And this was mentioned, and I was really happy that it came up. And this is not my area of expertise, but I do believe that in some points, in some things that we are exposed to, for example, and I'll take something which maybe is much easier to embrace. When we're talking about nutrition, for example, we can do many things in terms of teaching, putting regulations and teaching the populations of how to reduce different substances that we do not want to, and we don't want them to enter our bodies. But in terms of indoor air quality, sometimes we do not have, we probably won't have the best solution for how to really stop the pollution and stop the indoor air quality from being not so optimist. And therefore, ventilation is something that I really think that we should think about specifically when we talk about the health risks. And I don't have time for this, but just one little paper that I brought here that talks about this exactly. It was published 2 years ago. It was done in China, in Shanghai, among students, where in a randomized double-blind crossover trial, they used real or sham indoor air purifications for 9 days, and they collected urine from these students, from these college students, and they compared the urine between the days where there were purified air and non-purified air, and they saw very nicely that the exposure, of course, was decreased, and they could see it in the urine, and the metabolic profile, they used the metabolomics that I mentioned before, they used it here, and they really found a difference between students who were exposed to air that was purified and air that was not purified. So, well, with this I'll finish. My time is up, and I'll be happy to take questions when we have time.